All right.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our live chat today about the Shadow Factory. We have Anna Katrina Shedletsky today and Kevin Goring. Anna is the co-founder and CEO of Instrumental, and Kevin is a partner and leader in McKinsey's operation practice. He's also the leader of McKinsey's North American manufacturing sector. So we're just going to wait a little bit just to see, just to allow a few other people to join, and then we'll get started in just a minute. And I think people are all hopping on. So I think, yeah, with that, I'll hand it over to you, Anna.
All right. Maybe as people are still filing in, we can start with a little bit of an icebreaker. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell us about the first factory you ever visited and what kind of factory it was and what you remember about it.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, so I guess I can answer that in a couple ways because I like to pretend that pre-McKinsey I was a submarine guy, and there's a lot of what I did was run the nuclear power plant. And so as much as that's not a factory, I like to pretend that that was factory experience and operations, and got to see kind of I think firsthand a lot of really best practices on standard work, operating procedural compliance, et cetera, that's quite transferable. So that doesn't really count. So I guess I'll answer your question more specifically. I think at Coca-Cola bottling factory, actually, probably back in 2011 or so. First joined McKinsey in the operations practice, and you kind of was in Atlanta. So obviously Coca-Cola is big there, and there's a lot of training going on at the time. And just going and seeing kind of the incredible volume and quality controls going on at that scale, I think stuck with me for sure and kind of turned me onto it. I was doing a lot of other operational work at the time, a lot of back office support type stuff. And you go into a facility like that, it's kind of an eye opener and wanting to roll your sleeves up and do some pretty interesting stuff. So that's my long-winded two-part answer.
All right. All right. That sounds awesome. I certainly remember my first factory, which was the Apple iPod factory. And my core takeaway was that all the parts that I had designed for our proto build needed to be redesigned after I saw operators like really like shaking, struggling to try to put those things together. There's just
EFMA,
nothing
nice.
quite like really seeing where your work is going to take place to make you into a better engineer,
That is very
particularly for
true.
a factory. So we're going to get into our topic today, which is the shadow factory, the part of the factory that's maybe a little bit less visible. And I know that Kevin, you have kind of, you call the hidden factory, and you have kind of this larger concept that you work on with your clients. What is the shadow factory, the hidden factory? How would you define it?
Yeah, I mean, kind of the way that we see it manifest. Obviously, I kind of cut a lot of across a lot of industries, but a lot of the discrete manufacturing build, it's kind of this bone pile or the boneyard or this, the whip stack ups kind of around the facility. I think when you think of a well-run operational facility, there's obviously safety stock definitions in the build process based on tack times and variability and build and variability in supply and variability in demand. But a lot of the stuff that gets kind of stuck outside of that once you start putting the product into the system and it can't come out the other end as planned. So that'll build up, a lot of what we see with contract manufacturers, for example, is, that boneyard building up, bone pile building up, where you might have a lot of in-process testing that's failed, and you've got just stacks and stacks of inventory built up throughout the facility. And I think a lot of what we see when we go into companies is, for contract manufacturers, electronics players, et cetera, is, 5, 6, 10x the inventory stacked up throughout the facility because it's built up over time. And, it's not really in the plan. It's not part of the process, but holy cow, it's a big cost. Not only an inventory holding cost, but you're taking a lot of manpower. So I think that kind of hidden factory and that hidden set of material that's kind of not necessarily well set up and tracked in systems is a massive driver of inefficiency and cost.
What are some of the costs of the bone pile that like maybe like you can think of it as like, well, there's the obvious cost of like this product didn't get yielded out at the end of the line at
Yeah.
the time that you expected. That's the obvious one, but I feel like there's layers there, and I think some of the people that we talk to are a little as they start thinking about it, they're like, oh, actually, this does hit other types of costs on my line. Like, how would you describe that to customers who are maybe, or clients that are maybe a little bit skeptical about like how big of a cost that is if they've already like taken the yield hit?
Yeah, and to your point, there is the inventory holding cost that's big, right? I mean, a lot of companies are carrying that at 10%, something along those lines of just actual cash. Now you free that up, it's only a one-time savings, but there is a carrying cost associated with it. So obviously there's kind of the double hit. You can free it out, you can unleash some output, but then the carrying costs. I mean, I think some of the other pieces, obviously obsolescence is a big piece, and that's kind of encompassed in some of the carrying costs sometimes, depending on how companies calculate this. But this stuff sits here for months, years on end, and in a fast moving contract manufacturing type environment, electronics environment, that's going to go obsolete pretty fast. Those are the easy ones. Those are the ones everyone accounts for. I think the bigger probably hitters that we often see is those are sitting in a bone pile for some reason. Usually because they are failing some sort of subtest or sitting in sort of a holding area. So obviously a lot of cost associated with testing those, retesting those fail. And that the folks that are actually driving that testing and the rework, that's a big inefficiency, cost. There's an inefficiency cost to just the operators that are working around this stuff. I'm sure anybody that's dealing with this doesn't exactly help with flow when you think of lean concepts. So if you've got operators that are moving up and down lines, if you got the stuff stacked up everywhere, you've got people looking for things, you've got parts and pieces everywhere, massive losses. So I think the categories are, like I said, that conventional carrying costs associated with it, the obsolescence, the testers themselves, and then the impact on the operators that are actually trying to work around the line. So just kind of bits and pieces of this stuff. And I think what we see is it ends up just driving nickel and dimes of inefficiencies everywhere that add up to dollars. So you get those bits and pieces of everybody losing a little bit of time here and there. If you can clean that out, you get the flow cleaned up, you get the retesters actually working on nice engineering problems as opposed to kind of reactive pieces. It's a massive unlock.
Yeah, I was really surprised speaking with a client who and I think this is common in certain like kind of sub verticals in electronics where the line is gated by test and test capacity because test equipment's expensive. So like you kind of design it to work for your optimal like one pass through your line. But because there's such a large fallout like post test that is at the test itself causes fallout, those units are circulating and cycling through test over and over again. And so you're taking some percentage of your test efficiency offline, which was part of your like first pass plan through for that kind of, I guess, the non-shadow factory. I don't know what the non-shadow factory is, the first factory. I don't know. The one that's more visible and apparent. And so from her perspective, like she couldn't build more tests because it was like multi-million-dollar test equipment and her throughput is entirely gated by tests. And so these pieces of equipment are taking away capacity on that test from new input. And then another thing a customer told me is they didn't even know how many times things actually ended up going through. Like they don't have metrics or charts or data. Like I'm sure they could go dig and find the data, but there's no like clear, here's how many times this unit has gone through this test and been retested and been repaired and then cycled again. And they told me that they found units that had gone through that whole process 50 times. Yeah. And like as a customer, I don't really think I want that unit. Every time you're like touching it, right? Like this is like a less capable system.
Yeah.
Why do you think that? Oh, go on. Sorry.
I was gonna say, yeah, you don't want that unit. You also don't want to pay for the inefficiencies that you just caused by everything happening there, and your SLAs are now garbage because everything's stacked up for 2 or 3 extra days. So yeah, absolutely. And those, the data and the visibility on it, not just the fact that it's thrown in there, but the fact that it keeps getting reintroduced. And yeah, if you're at 20% failure first time through, and then chances are, I think what we see a lot of times is the second pass yield almost is sometimes worse because you're introducing a lot of faulty components and systems, and the problem solving just isn't that great. So when you've got these shadow factories and these hidden factories, just the complete lack of visibility and data behind them, like you said, it's not the first time through, it's the multiple impact. It keeps hitting the system.
Why do you think this isn't measured? It seems like it could be measured. It seems like the number of times a unit goes through a test would be like a clear thing that you could pull out of MES. Like how long something sits in the bone pile feels like this should be even what size it is. I think many operations leaders I talk to, they know, how many millions of dollars of inventory is in their bone pile, but that's kind of like the main KPI they have. And then they know how much like obsolescence they're doing on a quarterly basis out of it because of expired parts or things like that they're no longer going to ship. But why do you think that there aren't like lower level metrics that operations, even maybe not the C-suite, senior vice presidents are looking at, but like the plant managers and that where it's
Yeah,
so
no,
hidden?
it's a great question. And the answer is it should be monitored. And it's a lot of, when you can kind of shine a light on the size of the opportunity of this thing, I think companies become incentivized. But the problem with this is a lot of times this stuff kind of builds up over time. So obviously when you set up the factory, this is a quite small number. So you build up your technical systems and your MES and your organization in a way that doesn't really have to account for this, and kind of things go bad, things go sideways, a test fails, you've got bad firmware in one set or something, and now all of a sudden you've got this built up and holy cow, okay, we think we can manage it, we're going to build it into the system. So it's a very reactive, it's not built into the initial infrastructure. So it does take a very specific side project, if you will, to acknowledge it's an issue, to link your systems, integrate the tech, and pull out the problem solving that you need to. It's not super, super difficult, but it is doable, but it requires real focused effort. And it's, I think when you can rack and stack it against your other problems, it would float to the top, but it's a matter of doing that work and not being in a constant firefight mode where it's just one of many things on your plate.
Can you so part of the problem is because it's like hidden.
Mhm.
You don't know how big of a problem is. You just mentioned if you did know how big it was and then it was like ranked in with other things that you could be working to improve, that it would be probably towards, if not the top item. Can you give some like finger in the wind kind of, or maybe some examples of like how big can this problem actually be for a manufacturer? Obviously the particularities of the product like matter a lot, but like, I don't know, any kind
Yeah, I
of
mean, it's
metrics you might be able to throw out to give people an idea that it's even worth spending maybe a small project to go investigate how big it is for their particular situation.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I'll talk very broad numbers here, but I mean, to your earlier point, the easy calculation is oftentimes just the inventory carrying costs and the inventory. And I think what we see very commonly is 5 to 10x the inventory of safety stock and planned inventory is sitting in these bone piles. That's not uncommon.
Wow, 5 to
So
10x of
sometimes,
your
yeah.
safety stock.
I mean,
Okay.
you walk around these factories, and I'm sure a lot of folks on the call have seen this too, where you look at WIP tagged up issue bone pile stuff versus clean content material, and it's night and day. I mean, you're tripping over all of the stuff that needs to be retested and reworked. So that stuff is very, that one's a little bit easier to pull. I think the what you asked earlier is where there are other levers to pull. And what is the sizing of it? It's kind of hard to say. What I would say in some of the examples that we've seen for contract manufacturers is 10% of the workforce going back and working through this rework. I would argue the impact to the operations team is probably smaller than that, probably a couple percent, because they're just pushing through. But the folks that are actually doing the rework, looking around for components, parts, et cetera, that could be a significant portion of the workforce that's been built up over the time. And what I would say is if you look at your workforce and you've got a significant portion of folks that are working on rework or the bone pile build down or the retest, that's kind of indicative of this problem kind of manifesting. And if you can say, look, this is 10%, you're never going to get rid of all of that. But if you can kind of fix this system and clean up the data and understand what's causing these defects and root that out, get rid of half of that. So you're talking, up to 5%. I think the 10% accounts for a little bit of the fact that they're usually a little bit more expensive portion of the workforce as well. So
Yeah,
when
they're
you're
more skilled,
when you're
and
talking
technical.
rework, engineers, testing folks versus manual assembly folks that are snapping pieces together, it's usually the higher end, higher cost buckets.
So you think when you say 5 to 10%, you're talking about like 5 to 10% of the cost of the workforce, not the count of the people.
Yeah, and I mean, it depends on how
Because
you
it's,
put DL, IL, but yeah, I'd put that on like the DL cost bucket. Yeah, just the
yeah.
overall cost structure.
So that's a good like finger in the wind on like, okay, I should maybe
Yeah.
look into this.
Yeah, yeah. And if you can disaggregate your workforce and say how many of them are actually working the retest, this becomes very easy.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I encountered a customer who described that actually, one of the benefits of the bone pile is that they can make their quarterly numbers by squeezing stuff out of it at the last minute. But this seems like not the best setup as your plan A. That seems like a plan C or D kind of situation.
Yeah, I
Better
mean,
to prevent it and yield it the first time.
well, yeah, I mean, to your point, if you failed at once, the chance, I would say that if you've built up a bone pile that's this big, you're actually not that great at problem solving and fixing the issues. So if you're going to go try to squeeze that at the end of the quarter, you're going to be putting a bunch of
There could be
fault
some risk in the field.
components. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're basically just going to drive a bunch of inefficiency in. Yeah, ideally you build that out in a separate way. Yeah.
All right. So I come from consumer electronics, and while there are bone piles there, it seemed far less prevalent than what I've seen in some of the commercial electronic side, such as electronics for data centers, rackable products, servers. It just seems like a bigger challenge there. Maybe because, well, I'm interested in whether that resonates with you. Maybe it doesn't resonate at all. Like, are there certain parts of the vertical that seem to have more challenge or less? And why that might be, if you see that. And if you don't see that, like, why do you think it's actually the same across?
Yeah, and where I've actually seen the differentiator, and I might have put a false linkage here, but product life cycle time and NPI introduction.
Yeah.
NPI introduction, a bit redundant. NPI cycling, right? So when you look at these companies that are putting a new product in every 3 months, altering the line, changing test processes, and then 18 months down the road, you're bringing in a new product and scaling that one out. You never really get super efficient at rooting out some of those issues. So those product life cycles seem to be compressing as technology is kind of advancing, and it's tougher and tougher to get that efficiency down and speed in time before your stockpile builds up. So it's almost like you start to get it under control, your learning curve kind of comes down a little bit, and then boom, you got a new product. That's not all of it, but I think it's putting more pressure into the system and saying, you need to get better at this faster. You need to get data and information better, faster, to burn this out quicker. Otherwise, it's just going to exacerbate and get worse and worse. And then you talk about obsolescence. Now you've got, an organization that hoped to use this at the end of a quarter, but now it's just completely their own product because it's been sitting there for 2 years.
Yeah, particularly if it's like a commercial, on the commercial side, B2B style electronics. Yeah. I think that's a good point. Like high volume consumer electronics, you do this massive explosive ramp where you go from 1 or 2 lines to like 50 lines in some crazy ramp. And then all those units that essentially don't pass the first time through, you've got a rework process where you're just like generally eating super low rework yields.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much circulation is actually happening. It's kind of the parts tend to be all like, the tiny flexes, like things get damaged enough that like the bone pile doesn't build up because it just becomes scrap. Whereas like if you think about a server, those products are, while they can still be damaged, just like a lot less finicky than like a tiny little smartwatch or a phone or something doesn't have as many flex cables. It's got like actual real plugs and receptacles in it with real wires. And so like they're frankly more reworkable. So there's like almost more hope that because there's more hope in the reworkability of the product, they circulate for longer as you try to like get it through the process. And that makes sense about the MPI like explosion life cycle. Being too short to actually even create this problem. But it also makes sense for the longer life cycle products where it's going to ship for a year or 2 in production, maybe longer. You can still have obsolescence because people want, the configuration, especially if you're like kind of build to configuration for customers, like they want like the newest chip or they want, this specific thing. And you may not have that if you're not if you have multiple SKUs or some sort of mixed configuration for customers.
Right.
So, okay, we talked about the problem a lot. Maybe we probably got people convinced that there is a problem here.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how we might solve that problem. So what do you think best practice looks like for, let's talk about like the rework and bone pile management, even just understanding it. What do you see as best practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are degrees of this. Best practice to me is kind of the far right-hand side, which probably takes a bit to get to. The foundation, I think, to your point, is just like creating visibility on this, which sounds easy, and frankly is if you put some focus on it. But linking some of your systems, different parts of the process, whether it's your ERP at the macro level, or you're down in an MES, or even if you've got kind of more discrete IoT platforms where you can actually take a look and see where your products are in traceability. I think first and foremost, it's creating that, knowing what's in your bone pile and what caused them to be there. That sounds very easy. But I mean, we go into a lot of these facilities, there's stickers on retest, you know, on stuff in the bone pile, like physically manually written stickers. May or may not be sitting in an Excel somewhere or something, but like the volume and the technology that's required to create these advanced products, and then you look at something like that happening. I mean, I think that should be kind of high point number one. If you're walking around your facility and the way that it's tracked is Excel or stickers, then, you know, let's get the visibility right first. So I think visibility and tracking is number one, and that is what
And
is
is
in
that
it.
like buying a software? Is that like leveraging your like PLM or MOM tools that you might already have? Like, what does that typically end up being if you're trying to get away from Excel and like paper passport
Yeah, I'd
tracking?
argue, yeah, PLM for sure. I mean, a lot of MES systems actually have functionality for this. There's bolt-on applications for additional tracking. And I mean, even maybe Excel is step one beyond the sticker tracking, right?
Excel's still better than handwritten,
Yeah,
probably.
so you go handwritten Excel, probably MES, PLM type things, and then you've got bespoke solutions, of course, that if you're laying out a broader transformation and you're really going to lay out a new foundational element for Industry 4.0, I'd argue you probably want to go beyond just your MES and create a little bit more targeted visibility. I don't have kind of the half dozen or so solutions that would be best here. I've seen a couple in play, but focusing on that and building the applications even to just create that visibility. But again, having the drop down, even if it's as simple as what are the 15 drop down items that you've got to fill out in order for you to kind of track this over. That's kind of step one. That would be the traceability. Two would be, I would say, the analytics. That would be kind of the next one on, which is there's a whole lot of sources of information here. And this is where I will raise my hand and say I get frustrated at everybody throwing Gen AI around a lot these days. But actually, it is one of the most compelling use cases, I would say, is in something like this, in quality defect rework, et cetera. You've got information coming in from your supply base, what parts came in, you know what operators were working on things. If you want to go next level beyond just a Pareto of what's happening and where my parts are, what's causing it? Because gosh, CI and improvement might be really nice. And then I think the third horizon would be, how do you actually bring in OT and technology and solutions to preempt and prevent, as opposed to reactively, you know, that's where, you know, our organization got involved with yours, which is if you really go along that spectrum and say, I don't want to just collect data on why things are going bad. I want to prevent it from happening. So I don't want to just know that my operator is doing something bad after the fact and I can go train them. I want to see it real time. So whether it's camera systems, whether it's AI enabled, kind of machine learning enabled, you know, vision systems around it, whether it's, you know, other predictive algorithms and things that are saying, hey, you know, on Tuesdays in January, we tend to have an issue on these things. So I think it kind of runs the gambit there of just get the visibility right, get the analytics, and then go upstream into the OT side of the house. I think would be kind of the good to great.
And so if a leader is thinking about like, okay, I'm in the paper passport business, I don't know how big my pile is.
Yeah.
It seems like it makes sense, like that the investigation for like a point in time measurement of how big the pile is and how expensive it is probably not too heavy of a lift. But in terms of kind of going for that step one, like that traceability bit,
Mhm.
of the challenge. I think that's where a lot of leaders can sometimes, if they're in the state where they don't have much, where that can feel particularly challenging, because traceability itself, it's really hard to point to the ROI of traceability.
Yeah.
But you can't like act on your Pareto if you don't even have the Pareto of like why things are ending up in your bone pile.
Yeah.
And so you almost want to justify it by like, well, it's everything in the Pareto, but it's
Yeah.
not quite. And
Yeah.
so is that something that you've encountered with customers, or how would you advise clients that like have kind of a will to want to make an improvement, but are feeling like that first step, like they're going to have to justify each step versus doing some major overhaul? How will they
Yeah.
justify the first step?
Yeah. What I would say is I think to your point, it's not a complex set of analysis. If you have industrial engineers or you have, just good lean folks, it can go, it frankly should take a couple days. I mean, give them a week or two and say, what's the size of the prize here? How many people do we actually have working retest? How big is this bone pile? And what kind of visibility do we have on it today? And then I don't have a one size fits all answer for how you kind of go lay out the ROI on it. That actually takes work, and it does. But if you have the what this is costing your organization, what I would say kind of is a very key next step, is if you're not getting kind of external help at this point from software providers, consultancies, OT folks, et cetera, this is why you have IT organizations. And a lot of times companies struggle with IT coming up with their initiatives, operations having problems. This is a very solvable real world problem that IT can help with. And if you've got an IT organization that's worth kind of, worth their salt, then they can either say, hey, we can do this, we can provide the visibility, or alternatively, we need some software patches, we need some MES support, we need some PLM support, et cetera. What is the minimum viable to get us to this? This should not be like a 5-year multi-million-dollar transformation to get this stuff visible. There are some
Yep.
baby steps here, and a lot of the software providers that you've got kind of today sitting in factories have the ability to do this. They just don't know the problem that they're solving. So again, that's where the IT and the ops folks can come together a little bit.
Yeah, like maybe make use of tools that you might already have in
For
place
sure.
versus trying to go buy something. Or maybe the lift is just kind of integrating a part of the tool you've already purchased that you never set up. This kind of
Guaranteed
thing.
there's some pieces and parts that you can leverage a little bit more. I mean, you've got the ability to walk those products through the non-shadow factory, whatever you called it before, the conventional factory. It's essentially an extra branch that's just not being tracked now. And whatever you're using in that system today to walk it through the main factory, you should be able to build that branch out in a pretty cost-effective way.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And at what point should, I guess maybe more general question, how does McKinsey help customers with this particular kind of issue? Like what would be the kind of, is this like usually part of an engagement, or do you ever have clients that reach out explicitly around just efficiency gains, and like the shadow factor is a big part of that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it goes back a little bit to what you talked about earlier. For an organization to self-assess and say this bone pile is a big enough issue where I want external help, somebody to come in and track it. If an organization is that kind of forward-leaning, they've usually kind of started something, they can start getting the visibility in place. We often see this when we come in and we look at a company that is having an issue elsewhere, and this is driving it. So we've got an SLA issue. We can't get the product out the door fast enough. We've got a capacity issue. We got our costs out of control. Our quality is horrible. We start peeling back, and then this kind of pops up, and it's one of the things. So when we lay out hey, if you want to get the SLA right, there's a half dozen things you got to do. This is oftentimes probably one of the biggest ones. And so we'll lay this out in kind of hey, this is one of 5, 6 things you need to do. Here's the tech stack behind it so that you aren't creating 6 independent tech stack systems. But for example, I know, we're working with a company now looking at this exactly where it's an SLA issue. And so we say, it's taking you X days, you need to get to Y. Holy cow, a lot of it's sitting over here. You've also got a lot of costs sitting over there. There's initiatives in, streamlining the front end, ordering process. There's initiatives around streamlining the build process. But then there's a couple of initiatives around this visibility of this bone pile, the analytics behind it, and then kind of the what's the camera systems, the technology, et cetera, that you want to bring in and proactively identify this stuff, so it's not just an after the fact. So to answer your question in a faster way, it's usually one of a set of initiatives. For a company that can self-identify this stuff and know it's a big deal, they can usually, this is attackable on their own.
I really like you identified some other symptoms that maybe, like, if you have these symptoms, you actually may have this problem. This may be a core part of the root cause.
Right.
Things like lead time, maybe field failures could even go in that bucket.
Sure.
Quality related issues, first pass yields being low by definition means that you're creating circulation and rework. So if you have those types of symptoms, that kind of makes a lot of sense, that there's digging in.
Exactly. And it's so funny because it's like, okay, we've got an SLA issue, and then you go walk around the factory the first time, and folks get, I mean, it's not that people are stupid or they don't care. They get in their day-to-day firefighting, but as an external person, you walk in and you go, holy cow, I'm just inundated by WIP, and there's just broken product everywhere. Like, it jumps out at you so fast. And I think you can look at the numbers pretty quickly, but it's pretty self-evident when you walk in and start seeing some of these things.
Yeah, I think Instrumental's perspective as a technology, specifically for the bone pile, as we've been educated by our customers, is if you can improve first pass yield, you just prevent the bone pile in the first place.
Yeah.
And so the use of a system like Instrumental explicitly to drive first pass yield improvements, whether that's for workmanship issues with operator training, part quality issues that are upstream, like if you can catch as well that a unit will likely fail your 8-hour test line, you don't have to put it in the 8-hour test, and you preserve capacity. So there's opportunities to kind of be proactive, get that proactivity kind of in one step. But I think all these underlying pieces of leveraging the systems that you may already have in place, PLM, MOM systems, maybe even QMS systems, these can all be places that can help leaders like get more visibility into the issue right away.
Yeah, and I think that's where exactly that kind of that good to great thing that I mentioned, where just get the visibility right. That'll get you kind of part of the way, but that's never going to proactively fix your things for you. And you're never, if you still have an inspector at the end of the day that needs to sit there and stare and look at something that's so small you would never catch it, you're never going to actually fix these things until you integrate these end solutions that are going to prevent this stuff. So huge
or
proponent
understand the root cause that causes
Even
those
why.
problems in
Yeah.
the first place. If you don't have the Pareto, you can't like knock down the bars on it, right? So I
Exactly.
think
Yeah.
one of the opportunities is to be able to be more proactive about, like in the case of one customer, they, from an operator training perspective, using Instrumental to discover issues. This is an untrained model. They're discovering issues, novel issues. Some of it's trained in, and it's like these are known issues in the inspection protocol. And they can see like, oh, Susie is on the line right now, and Susie just did this one. And so now I can like proactively go work with Susie to train her to do that job a little bit differently to prevent these kinds of errors. And that's like a constant firefighting, but by being able to know like right now while it's happening that it's happening, has enabled our customers to dramatically improve their first pass yields within days of being on the line, because there's just like much more data available about what's actually happening right now. But it makes a very good point.
Yeah, and I would say, look, I mean, that's always the case, right? Is you always want to get proactive about this stuff. You want to get real time with this. But I would say, given the compression and NPI cycle times, the learning curve, you're not coming down as fast. So this stuff's even more important. Identifying this stuff real time, catching these things, because you're never going to get up to that speed and pace and that learning curve that you want to. And I would also say just, I'm sure everyone on the call and listening is feeling the same thing, but turnover these days and attrition and people issues, you can have all the Paretos you want in the world, but if you're not catching these things as they're happening, you're going to be in information overload and not fixing it mode pretty quickly. So yeah, I think the moving quickly to the right side of being able to catch some of this stuff is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this is really awesome. I'd love to see if there's any questions from our live audience. We're happy to, I know Kevin's happy to take questions and answer from the live audience. And so if you have them, I think you can use the Q&A portal to enter your question. And we'll see if there are any. But yeah, I guess what's the most surprising thing that you've discovered? Maybe it's with a client in particular, or maybe just your own experience working in the space. What's been the most surprising thing about WIP and rework that you think like maybe others might not understand, or maybe like the engineering side, like the MPI side of an organization might not understand about their operations counterparts?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think the easy answer is just the staggering size of the opportunity, right? Which I think before I kind of got under under the covers here, you see rework rates and you see first-time failure rates that are higher than you would see in most other, in a lot of other industries. But then the compounding impact of it. And I think that's kind of one. And then the second is just the lack of, so we've talked a lot about the lack of visibility, but there's also like a lack of really good link of root cause problem solving on these things in a lot of cases. So, you'll have the tag that says, we think it's an issue of this component not fitting. Okay, we'll put a new one in, we'll retest it, may or may not pass. I mean, just the robustness of the linking of the data sources and the real understanding. There's so much more on these pretty complex, expensive components. There's a lot of crapshoot going on, of just trying to do your best to fix it, as opposed to, wow, these are pretty complex components. We should be better than this, and we should be ahead of what's causing this. And are there leading indicators that help me identify when something's about to go bad and what that answer is? And that's where I say I actually am quite excited about Gen AI and some of these other things that are going on, where you can say, let's take this information from camera systems, let's take this information from suppliers, and let's tell our testers what the answer is, as opposed to making them figure it out in a pretty complex environment.
That's great. Awesome. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions, so I think we'll wrap up. Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us today and for talking about the Shadow Factory. I think there's a lot to dig into here, and I know our subscribers are going to really enjoy hearing about your expertise in this topic. So thank you so much.
Great chatting with you as well. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everybody.